One of the jobs that people building boats find most irritating is sanding, which will be no surprise to any of you. And one of the worst sanding jobs of all is clearing up cured epoxy. It's just a fact of life that whenever you're working with epoxy, there will be excess material lying around. There'll be drips from cups, or if you're filling, by the very nature of the job itself, there will be excess lumps of cured epoxy to be cleaned up at a later date. When laminating and gluing, it's almost essential to have gloves, because we want to make sure there's a good squeeze out of material, and so I find that with any of my lamination jobs I always end up with excess material squeezed out from the edges, and it has to be cleaned up at some stage. Sanding is not the way to go. A lot of people start off sanding thinking that that's the only method of removing this material, but the fact of the matter is, if you sand a glob of epoxy, even a small glob of epoxy, it's inevitable that you'll sand into the surrounding timber. One way around it is to use a longboard or a sanding block, but even so, you'll still end up with a halo-like depression around the spot where the blob of epoxy was. Sanding is also noisy, dirty, takes a long time, makes a mess of your workshop. I'm going to show you a little trick here which will allow you to remove epoxy in the fastest possible way. That's for cured epoxy. Here in the foreground you can see the tools that are required for cleaning up cured epoxy. What we have here are simple hook scrapers. That's what the painters call them, I think. I call them triangular scrapers, and you can get them at the local hardware store. Normally they come with this triangular shape. Sometimes they'll be pre-prepared with curves of various radii, and they can be modified. As you can see here, I've modified this particular number just to suit a specific job. Here's a little one that started off as a completely full-size scraper many years ago, but with repeated sharpenings it's ended up being about the size of a thumbnail. It's very useful. I've profiled the ends, or one of the ends of this one, with a slight radius, and then there are two sharp points, but you can do anything you like. Behind there you can see a mill file that's used for sharpening, and then the primary bit of equipment that's also necessary is a heat gun. If you've got a really good hairdryer, you can just get away with a hairdryer, but it's worth investing some money in a good heat gun. Now, in order to give you some sort of demonstration, I have prepared for you earlier a big blob of epoxy. And here it is. I put it straight down on my bench. Went down yesterday, so it's had close to 24 hours of curing now. Big long smear. Hopefully I would never be this untidy with my work, but I'm going to try to clear this up to show you the effectiveness of the use of a heat gun and a scraper. It's essential for success with this use of paint scrapers for cleaning up epoxy that the edge be kept sharp. Now, it doesn't have to be done in any complex way. It doesn't involve the use of wet stones or oil stones. Simply a mill file and the edge of a bench. I'll demonstrate with the triangular model here, the simple method of sharpening. It only takes a moment or two. I hook the corner of the scraper over the edge of a bench. You can do it on a sawhorse, anywhere that's handy, and then just sweep across the face at an angle like this, just enough to sharpen up the edge. The whole process only takes a minute or two. When it comes to the rounded shaped scrapers, that can be done exactly the same way. You just have to use a slightly different technique to try to keep a smoothly rounded surface. And while you're at it, you can modify the radius in particular areas to make the tool specifically suited to an individual job. So that's all that's required in sharpening these scrapers. When you first start warming the surface, it pays to just initially warm up the scraper as well, because it cuts better when it's warm. So I normally just give it a bit of a twirl around in front of the heat gun, and then just give the surface of the epoxy a little bit of a warm up. Now, the idea with warming the epoxy is to warm it enough to soften it, but no more, because we don't want to damage the epoxy. If it's not warm too much, when it cools down it'll regain 100% of its physical properties. I only hold the scraper lightly, basically just thumb and forefinger pressure. Here we go. I'm continually moving the gun, and this material is coming off. It's almost like planing a piece of timber. It really is a very, very easy thing to do, and you can feel the timber underneath. The scraper is being held so lightly that it's never going to damage the timber. It's just planing across the surface. But the epoxy, particularly if it's relatively fresh like this, it's only been on for 24 hours, it's still not completely cured. That'll take probably 2 weeks. But at the moment, it comes off nicely and easily. And as you can see here, I've removed a very large surface area of epoxy, and it was quite thick. It's, in some places it was probably 3/8 of an inch thick, say 9 or 10 millimeters thick. I've almost finished. The surface is smooth, and all that's required once I've finished this removal of the bulk of the epoxy is just to give the surface of the timber a light sanding with, say, 120 grit paper. And unlike the situation where you're trying to sand the epoxy itself away, cleaning up what is left from this scraper work will only take a moment or two. Now I'll move to a really heavy blob. I made this one as thick as I could yesterday. It would be an absolute nightmare to remove the sandpaper, and we'll see how fast this one takes. How fast the removal is. Need to keep an eye on the surrounding timber so that there's no scorching occurs. It shouldn't do at the temperature the gun's set at the moment, but sometimes if you concentrate too hard on a particular spot and forget to move the gun around, there can be some minor scorching. Right, there we go. I'll guarantee that job would have taken an hour with a sander and it would have ended up being a mess. There we have my workbench back ready for operation again.